Welcome to the Newsworthy. All the day's news in less than 10 minutes. Fast, fair, fun, and on the go. Today we are talking about everything from what's happened at the NATO summit to Twitter kicking off fake followers. Plus, Kylie Jenner is almost the youngest self-made billionaire ever. Those stories and many more in less than 10 minutes. And hang out today after the news for 3 Question Thursday. We are chatting about the President's Supreme Court pick, why it matters, and what happens now. I'm Erica Mandy. Today is Thursday, July 12th. You ready? Let's do this. It is day 2 now of the NATO summit in Brussels, and it's already had a fairly tense start, although the 29 member countries also came together and signed an agreement before day 1 was over. So first, the tense part. The Washington Post reports President Trump openly criticized NATO allies, saying they should double their military spending, claiming they're not paying their fair share in the alliance. He also called Germany, quote, captive to Russia, saying Germany gets too much of its gas and energy there. Critics, though, fired back, some saying no country in the world could meet those demands for military spending. And Germany's chancellor made a strong statement to say Germany is not controlled by Russia at all. Okay, so what about the agreement part? Well, they all signed a document that, in part, was critical of Russia, and it said they're all committed to the shared costs and responsibilities of the alliance. The NATO Secretary General said, quote, at the end of the day, we all agreed that North America and Europe are safer together. So what's still ahead this week? Day 2 of the NATO summit, of course, is today. Then President Trump goes to England to meet with British Prime Minister Theresa May. Then he'll meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin next week. And speaking of England, they are out of the World Cup. England lost to Croatia yesterday after 2 overtimes with a final score of 1-2. That means Croatia gets a spot in the World Cup final for the first time in the team's history. So it's set now. Croatia faces France in the final on Sunday. But first, England and Belgium will play one more match to see who gets to claim third. eSports is coming to ESPN with live TV coverage of the Overwatch League. eSports, if you don't know, are video game competitions where people watch professional video gamers play. And Overwatch is a specific video game that now has a league of its own. It says it's the first major global esports league with city-based teams, and it just launched in January. CNBC says the Overwatch coverage began this week with the playoffs and is airing across ESPN and Disney networks, as well as a recap show on ABC. Both the TV and video game companies are hoping to reach new customers and viewers with this big new deal. You may remember seeing him in Papa John's commercials in the past, but now the founder and public face of the pizza company is dealing with a lot of backlash. Forbes first reported the founder, John Schnatter, used the N-word on a conference call, and now Schnatter has admitted it. He said, no matter the context, I apologize. He used the N-word while on a call about media training. Instead, it seems he's made things worse. He had already stepped down as Papa John's CEO because of the backlash he faced last year, talking about how the NFL handled the national anthem protests. And now he has just resigned as chairman of the board, and he had to step down from the University of Louisville's Board of Trustees as well. Twitter is going after fake followers starting today. It'll be kicking millions of accounts off its platform, and the Wall Street Journal says it may mean the number of followers you have on Twitter could go down. The company says most people will only lose a few followers, but celebrities and those with bigger numbers may see a bigger decrease. And the people impacted the most will be the ones who actually paid for followers. Because yes, that does happen. In fact, there are companies that sell people social media followers. Twitter execs reportedly credit a New York Times investigation earlier this year for pushing them to look into this issue even more. Oprah just got into the restaurant biz. Business Insider reports she invested in True Food Kitchen. Have you heard of it? It's a healthy food restaurant chain with 23 locations in 10 different states, but you can probably expect it to expand quite a bit now. In fact, CNN says True Food Kitchen expects to double its business over the next 3 years thanks to this extra cash. And Oprah's promotion and advice probably won't hurt either. She's also joining the company's board. This year, she's on the cover of Forbes' annual list of richest self-made women, Kylie Jenner, although some generations may know her more as Kim Kardashian West's younger sister. Jenner is just 20, and she's reportedly on track to becoming the youngest self-made billionaire ever, beating out people like Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, who reached $1 billion at age 23. Already, Forbes reports she's worth $900 million. How is she doing it? her makeup line, Kylie Cosmetics. And she uses her fame and social media following for all the marketing. Quick note, Emmy nominations will be announced this morning. You can watch the live announcements at emmys.com, or I'll be posting a link in today's show notes. And that's it for your main news roundup today, but it's now time for 3 Question Thursday, where I ask a few questions of a different expert about a different topic every Thursday after the news. Today, we are talking about an important one, the U.S. Supreme Court and the president's pick to replace Justice Anthony Kennedy, who is retiring. So today, you'll hear why this matters, what you should know about the new nominee, and how it could affect issues like abortion. My guest today is Ann Voights. She's a partner of the law firm King & Spalding. She specializes in appellate litigation before all levels of state and federal appeals courts, and in the past, she served more than 10 years as an assistant U.S. attorney. All right, here's my conversation with Ann Voights. Ann, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Delighted to be here.
Before we get into discussing President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court justice, let's talk about why it's so significant. What is the importance of every person that becomes a Supreme Court justice?
Sure, absolutely. So let me start with saying one of the things that the justices can do is that, unlike courts below them who generally don't have that much choice in the cases that they handle in the appellate court, the Supreme Court gets to choose, with some limited exceptions, the cases it decides to hear. So when they're doing that, that sort of shapes the questions that get attention. Because the questions that come up in the Supreme Court, the ones that they choose to hear, are so open, for lack of a better answer, right? They're usually being taken because lower courts have disagreed about the right answer. So when you're looking at it, you aren't bound by what other courts have done. You're not even bound by what the Supreme Court has done before. Although typically people give respect to the concept of stare decisis. So if the Supreme Court has decided the issue previously, it should, at least in theory, defer to that unless there's been some significant reason to change or to ignore that precedent.
President Trump nominated Brett Kavanaugh as his nominee, and Bloomberg reported that if the Senate confirms him, it'll be the most conservative Supreme Court in a long time. What do you think, and are there a couple of key things people should really take away from this pick?
Sure. Well, whenever you're thinking about a pick for the Supreme Court, part of it depends on who you're looking at, right? I mean, who's the person that they're actually replacing? So one of the things about Justice Gorsuch, is that he was replacing Justice Scalia, who was already perceived as a very conservative justice. So he was, in essence, sort of extending Scalia's influence over the court, but it wasn't changing, really, the vote count. But because Justice Kennedy has very much been viewed as a swing vote, although he personally doesn't like that term, the installation of someone who is either significantly more conservative or significantly more liberal would swing the balance. If the court swings whichever way, if it swings too dramatically one way or the other, you lose some of the stability and predictability that's important for the judicial system. And usually that's sort of cabined, again, by that principle I talked about earlier of stare decisis, the idea that even if you may disagree with a prior Supreme Court decision, for the most part, you think of yourself as bound to follow it. So one of the things that people will think about is stare decisis, and that was actually one of the things that some of the senators had mentioned as being important in their consideration.
Speaking of the Senate, as you know, they must confirm Brett Kavanaugh before he'll actually become a Supreme Court justice. Do you think that will happen? And what's the timeline for that?
To give you a sense of what the time has been like in the past, so Justice Gorsuch, it took about 65 days between nomination and confirmation. But that's actually on the shorter side. For example, Justice Kagan and Justice Alito, both of them, it took more like 80 days. So if you took those rough limits, he would get confirmed, if he were confirmed, sometime between like September 12th and October 4th, probably. But there are a number of people who are talking about whether it should be pushed back until after the election.
There's been a lot of talk about the potential impact on Roe v. Wade. Of course, that's the landmark decision that essentially legalized abortion in the U.S. So what do you think about the potential impact on that case?
When you're looking at Roe v. Wade, I mean, there's sort of the overall question about does it become overturned? But there's also sort of a second question, which is it undercut in so many different ways, sort of death by a thousand cuts, so to speak, that it's a right nominally, but not actually one in practice. So for most women, is it actually accessible, or are states allowed to impose enough limitations that as a practical reality, it's not available? And I think, when he was last confirmed, they said, was that as a circuit judge, it was not, he was bound by stare decisis to respect Roe versus Wade. But that was framed in terms of the position for which he was nominated at that point, a circuit judge who is bound to follow Supreme Court precedent. And so I think one of the cases that's going to get a lot of attention in his confirmation fight is a much more recent one when he was on the circuit, where he dissented over the issue of whether a pregnant teen who was in the custody of the government for immigration reasons, whether the government was obligated to take her to a place where she could get an abortion or not. And he dissented very strongly and said the government should not be obligated to have to facilitate it for her. But the issue with judicial nominations generally is that you don't get a whole lot of answers, right? Most candidates are told, and generally stick to the script, that their role in the confirmation hearings is not to comment about anything that could be related to a specific case.
Final thoughts on this whole issue?
It's bound to be an incredibly heated confirmation fight. If you look at some of the, both sides are really gearing up to spend a lot of money and a lot of energy on this. And I think the takeaway is that elections have consequences. If you were somebody who supported President Trump, I think you're probably really happy with his pick. And if you're someone who didn't, you're probably not so much happy.
Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. I so appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much.
And since she's an attorney, it's important for me to note that her views are hers alone and don't necessarily reflect the views of any of her current or former employers. And you can read more about this topic and our guest today by checking out today's show notes. That's also where you'll find more about all the news mentioned today. Just go to thenewsworthy.com, click episodes, and find today's date. The Newsworthy is ready for you by 4 a.m. Eastern Time every weekday, so we will chat again tomorrow. Have a great day.